moderation bit in the afternoon, but I will start. Our first presentation will be given in English, and I would like to ask Katrina Marsden. Well, I would like to welcome her first of all. She's working for an EU platform. It is called Adelphi, and it is about the coexistence between wolves or large carnivores and our livestock, cattle, horses, etc. She's in charge of biodiversity and nature conservation, and she will give us an overview of the funds for livestock protection. Ms. Marsden, welcome to you, and we are looking forward to your presentation.
English wechseln.
Yes, thank you very much. I will now speak in English.
Okay, good. Thank you. I'm Katrina Marsden, and as I was introduced, I work for Adelphi. Adelphi is actually a consultancy and research institute based in Berlin, working on environmental issues generally. But I'm here more in my role of managing the Secretariat of the EU Platform on Coexistence Between People and Large Carnivores. I'll give a very quick introduction to the platform now. It was the platform that commissioned the work I'll present afterwards on the use of CAP funds for livestock protection. So briefly on the platform itself, it's a grouping of EU-level stakeholders who've agreed a mission to promote ways and means to minimize and wherever possible find solutions to conflicts between human interests and the presence of large carnivores by exchanging knowledge and working together. In addition to the mission, the platform has some principles and ways of working, basically that they'll respect legal requirements and that they'll work within scientific boundaries, that they'll recognize socioeconomic and cultural considerations as well. So those are the kind of most important principles. They've also agreed the ways of working, that they respect each other, that they work together in a respectful way, that they're willing to learn from one another's experience, both from the conservation side and from the socioeconomic and the effects of large carnivores on particular sectors. The platform is made up of 7 members representing different interests, and it's chaired by the European Landowners Organization and by the European Commission. So the European Commission isn't a member, but it does finance our work at Adelphi and Callisto, our partners who make up the Secretariat and carry out the pieces of research that the platform members wish for to carry out their work. And it's one of these pieces of work that I want to present now on the Common Agricultural Policy. So I'll start with saying a little bit about what the Common Agricultural Policy is and what the rural development programs are, then talk about the status quo, the use of CAP funds for livestock protection across the EU currently, and the future options under the new CAP from 2023. So starting with what is the CAP? In the current funding period from 2014 to 2020, it's actually been extended for another 2 years because it took some time to agree the CAP due to various different reasons, including COVID and the Ukraine war, but also changes within the Commission and the Parliament. So it's 2 years late, and the current CAP is still running from the one from 2014. It's made up of 2 different financial instruments. One paid through Pillar 1, which is direct support to farmers across the EU. That's a basic payment and a greening payment, and that makes up the majority of the CAP, so over 300 billion, so still a very large proportion of the EU budget. And then Pillar 2, which is the rural development support, around 100 billion, and funded through the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development. That's topped up with co-financing, so that's national and regional financing added to the EU financing. And that's necessary for all member states to also dedicate their own funds to the rural development programs. Currently, all livestock protection measures are funded through this Pillar 2, the European Agricultural Fund for Regional Development, together with the co-financing. So I'll say a little bit more on that. It's funded through a particular regulation of the European Parliament and the Council. It's compulsory for all EU member states to have a national or regional rural development programme. It's normally 7 years funding, with this time with a 2-year extension. And basically, it's a series of measures, a kind of menu, which member states can pick and choose from depending on what the needs are in their particular areas. So it can range from advisory services, establishing businesses, agri-environment. Certain measures are compulsory for member states to do. Others are voluntary, so they can choose whether they include them or not. And there are strict reporting and evaluation requirements, which can involve some bureaucracy as well. So what actions have been financed so far related to the protection of livestock from against large carnivores? Investment costs, such as buying fences or surveillance equipment and the maintenance costs of these. Livestock, buying livestock guarding dogs and also feeding and maintaining livestock guarding dogs. Staff costs, such as shepherding. Grazing premiere, so that's kind of a basic aerial payment on where there are in areas where there are large carnivores. And there's also the opportunity to fund technical advice and a vulnerability analysis. So these are all measures that are currently funded in particular EU countries. Apologies for the table, which is a bit difficult to read. Basically, we have the countries. So this just shows the actions financed up until now in the current funding period and the previous funding period within the rural development programs. On the left, we have the list of countries that have used these measures so far. There's 12 countries listed there. We then have the particular measure codes from the two different funding periods. And on the right, the measures that we've just described the purchasing, fencing, livestock guarding dogs, etc. Maybe the main message from this is that countries use a range of different measures within the rural development program. There's not one particular measure that's for livestock protection. So there's a bit of, there are options that you can choose. The main one used at the moment are agri-environment, which is an area-based payment in areas where there are large carnivores normally, and then investment measures, either non-productive investment, which is to support actions related to environment, or productive investment if it's linked to other agricultural measures. So I'll give a couple of examples. France makes by far the greatest use of the rural development programs. We then have an example in between, Slovenia, which also makes quite a lot of use, and then I'll come on to Germany, which doesn't use it much. So very briefly, because we should have a presentation from France, just to say that France is really making the most complete use, funding vulnerability analysis, shepherding, so actually paying for the salaries of shepherds, buying and supporting livestock guarding dogs, financing fencing, and also technical advice. So that's all funded through the rural development programs. There's quite wide eligibility, but on the other hand, it's restricted to certain areas where wolf presence is confirmed. What really stands out with France, of course, is the budget that they're putting into this. It's 29 million euros, and that's in 2020. So that's, partially financed by the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development and co-financed by the French managing authorities as is required. The example of Slovenia, it takes a little bit of a different approach. They started funding through national financing to cover the buying of electric fences, livestock guarding dogs, using shepherds, and they also give technical support. And then there's a top-up funding through the rural development program. So they use a mixture of national financing with quite a lot of advice attached, going in and checking the measures are put in place and that they're continuing to function, and then a kind of broader payment through rural development. So that's also an option to use a mixture of different funding sources. And finally, the example of Germany, much less financing going into protection measures. Of course, it's a regional matter, so the regions choose whether they watch which measures they fund and whether they do it at all, although most do choose to. And it's almost entirely funded through regional financing. There are a couple of regions that have tested the rural development programs, but generally European funding isn't used for this purpose in Germany. And there are probably various reasons for that, which maybe we'll come on to more in the discussion. So coming on to the new CAP, which will be starting at the beginning of next year. You recognize this slide. It looks quite similar in terms of the financial instruments. There's still the direct support, and then there's the rural development support with co-financing, so nothing has changed there. What has changed is that these two funding streams are linked together in what's called a CAP strategic plan. That has 9 objectives, which cover both funding areas. And the idea is that these funding streams should be working more together to achieve objectives that the member states have identified as important for themselves and for rural areas in this particular member state. So there shouldn't be so much separation between the different funding streams in the next period. And just as a reminder, the timetable, everything is a little bit late, but there has been a process of kind of discussions between the Commission and the member states on agreeing their CAP strategic plans, which started at the end of 2020, where the Commission gave recommendations. Then the member states implemented these theoretically with consultation with stakeholders. Plans needed to be submitted at the beginning of this year. Then there was a process of approval, and almost all the plans are now agreed with the Commission. There's still a couple outstanding, but it's pretty much through, and they will be starting at the beginning of next year. Maybe also to point out that they can be amended annually so that they're not written in stone now that they're approved. Just the point here maybe is that the rural development measures have stayed fairly similar in the new CAP. Within the direct payments, the main difference is the eco schemes. So instead of having a greening measure, eco schemes have been introduced, and these include a number of measures which could be of interest to coexistence with large carnivores, so particularly agroecology, support to low intensity grass-based systems, husbandry and animal welfare plans, high nature value farming, which can include support for shepherding. So this has some potential to be used for livestock protection. Again, similar graph, similar chart to my last slide, but with the addition of the new funding period. And there isn't a great deal of difference from last time round. Most member states, if they use the rural development programs previously, have continued to do so. A few new additions. Austria has included a measure for supporting keeping livestock guarding dogs, and that's included under the animal welfare payment, so a top-up payment in areas where there are large carnivores. And Germany, there's one region that's included protection for or purchasing and support for purchasing, fencing and livestock guarding dogs. And then there's a couple of member states that have dropped out of using rural development funds because they've moved that into national financing. So is there more potential in the new Common Agricultural Policy for funding livestock protection measures? I think the answer is potentially. This is some work we also carried out for the EU platform, where we looked at the types of actions, so looking at a range of different good practices, what actions are relevant for livestock protection. And we came up with a range of different types of action on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side is the parts of the Common Agricultural Policy through which these could be financed. So we have advice and awareness raising, fairly self-explanatory. Innovative financing, which means kind of moving towards ecotourism, eco-labeling, the kind of normal practical support measures, so buying livestock guarding dogs, buying fencing, etc. The maintenance of these measures, upkeep of the above. And then there's also things like risk management. So could there be more funding for insurance schemes, basically? And then collaboration and more general kind of targeted projects in a particular area to do with livestock protection. And on the right-hand side, there are where this is funded, where this could be funded through the rural development and through Pillar 1 of the CAP. So there's the agri-environment schemes as one of the main sources, but there are also a range of different other options. And I've listed the measure codes for those who are interested in technical details. You can come back and have a look at this later, but there are a few new options, and particularly the eco schemes is one area that could be of interest to look at in more detail, but currently isn't being used by member states. Member states have continued basically to use the agri-environment schemes and the investment as in previous funding periods. A couple of sites just where to find further information on the EU platform website. There's also a range of different national sites that give more information on how to put in place measures in the particular national context. And finally, a few different platforms, apart from the EU platform, there are regional platforms in 6 member states that have been funded by the European institutions. There's more information on the EU platform website. There's also a Balkan regional platform in the Dinaric region, and a project to establish land care across Europe, which is also looking at similar issues with pastoralism. So just a few points to take into the discussion. There are a range of different ways which livestock protection can be funded through the CAP currently, both through Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, direct payments and rural development. Currently, only rural development support has really been tested, but there are a range of other supportive actions, collaboration, advice, business support that could be used in the areas where there are large carnivores present. These haven't been tested, but the potential is there, and what's needed if there's a wish to do that is for stakeholders to be setting up project proposals and proposing these, because there is the potential already in the CAP strategic plans that exist. The difficulties, of course, are the timing of putting these measures in place with the return of wolf, particularly in Western Europe. It often is after the wolf returns rather than before. The need for advice and support, so just having the finance there isn't really enough. There's a need for a lot of advice to actually put the measures in place successfully. Thinking about who receives support and the eligibility issues, and then potentially bureaucratic issues, so the timing of receiving the funding, difficulties in applying, and of course, potentially political lack of support. So thank you for listening, and there's more information on the EU platform website.
Ja, Frau Marsden, erst einmal ganz herzlichen Dank für Ihren Überblick.
Yes, Ms. Marsden, thank you very much for your overview. 19 minutes, that is just on time, as we call it, just on time. And we now have the possibility to ask questions.
Und ich habe hier eine erste Frage für Sie in
And we have a first question for you in
Was
German.
sind die Gründe, dass
And
manche
that
Länder
question is,
wie
why do
Deutschland
some
nicht die
countries,
gesamte
such as
Förderung
Germany,
womöglich schwer
not
abgreifen? Also
exploit the
weshalb
whole
und dann in Deutschland
possibilities
sind
of
auch noch die
funding? And in
Bundesländer,
Germany,
die
it is
hier
also the
unterschiedliche Optionen
lands,
ziehen.
the
Was
so-called
sind also
Länder that
Beweggründe von
take
den
different
einzelnen Ländern
options.
in
But
Deutschland, auch
what
Bundesländern, so
are
zu
the
agieren?
reasons for the German Länder to act like that?
Sorry, I was switching between the English and the German there.
You can stay in English.
Yeah, no, that's true. So the question was why the different German lender are not taking up the option to use European funds to the full extent. Is that correct? I mean, there's probably a range of different reasons I mean, partly they are using their own lender funds, so that it's not that they're not funding this at all. There's also the question of the bureaucracy that it's potentially more difficult to use European funds because there are particular conditions attached. It might be simpler to set up a regional scheme, but there's also certainly political pressure that the CAP funds are seen to an extent to be funding that's allocated to agriculture, and that certain people would regard that as unfair that be then used for what are regarded as wildlife measures. So there's quite a lot of political pressure not to use CAP funds in certain areas. But as I said, it is being tested. I think in Baden-Württemberg is the region that's most recently included it as a possibility in their rural development program.
Mhm. Dann
Yes.
eine Meldung aus dem
Then there's a
Publikum.
question from the
Mauro
audience.
Bellardi.
Mauro
stellst du die
Bellardi.
Frage auf Englisch
Will you ask in English
oder Italienisch?
or Italian?
Can you hear me?
Did you do you
In English?
in English?
Yeah,
Okay.
okay. Yes. I have one info and one question for Katrina. So the info is that we, as Aliante, so a private NGO, we got funding under the RDP of Lombardia region in Italy on the measure 1, which is the measure about information 2 months ago, an information and demonstration project for farmers about damage prevention measures. I imagine that in the future RDP, this possibility will be replicated. And the question is about the curiosity of mine. At the beginning of the last RDP turn, I put a lot of hope in the measure 16. That is the cooperation measure. The measure funded farmers that got together to solve a common problem. So it seems perfect to me for our purposes. But then in reality, I realized that this measure was handled, at least in Italy, in a very political way by the states and the regions, at least in Italy. I don't know. Basically, I realized that the project about these measures were already decided at the political level, absolutely no space for innovation, ideas, and discussion. A failure for my point of view. I want to know if you know some positive experience of using this measure for large carnivores in Europe. Thanks.
I think LEADER has been used as the only cooperation measure that's really, that I know of. It doesn't, I wouldn't necessarily know of every example of the smaller cooperation projects. I know that in Finland, they have used LEADER successfully for certain awareness raising and collaboration measures. But really that's the only example that I do know of. So I think that it's fairly limited, but the potential's there. There was as well last time around an EIP, so on a European level, the agri-exchange groups, there was one on wildlife damages as well. So that was maybe the second example. But I think the main message is the options are there, but it does need people to push them forward and to actually use them.
Okay, dann habe ich noch eine Frage für Sie in Deutsch, Frau Marsden. Gibt es denn eine
thematische Übersicht, also eine Grafik, an overview? Is there a diagram that shows the flows of money from the EU via the institutions to the livestock keepers? Is there anything like that? Is there a chart, a graph, diagram, whatever?
I can't think of anything really. It would be a bit variable between member states, how exactly they set up their rural development fund, whether it's coming nationally or whether it's first going nationally and then regionally, etc. And who is eligible for particular measures. That's really a choice of the individual member state or region. So I'm not aware of anything that shows that particularly well, unfortunately.
Dankeschön.
Okay, thank you very much. And then also a question by Mr. Renner.
Wer ist denn dafür verantwortlich für
it
diesen
reads, who's
politischen
responsible
Druck?
for
Also
this
wer macht
political
Druck, dass nicht
pressure?
alle Gelder
Who
abgerufen werden?
pressurizes to make
Sollten
sure
wir
that
nicht
not all the
alles
money
dafür
is
tun,
taken
die
advantage
Tierhalter
of?
zu
Shouldn't we do
unterstützen?
everything to support the livestock breeders?
Yes, I think we should do everything to support livestock breeders. There is a lot of lobbying around the cap because it's a lot of money. So there's lobbying both on the European level and then at every other level, on the national level and on the regional level, about how it's actually implemented, because there are decisions made at every level. So kind of how the cap's agreed firstly on the European level, and then how the cap strategic plans are put in place. And there's a lot of different interest groups that are involved, but there's the agricultural lobby is obviously important, and then there are environmental lobby groups that are also involved. But currently, more intensive systems tend to receive more support through the cap, and there's a difficulty in changing that, I think.
Dankeschön. Jetzt haben wir noch 2 Fragen.
Thank you very much. We have 2 questions in 3 minutes. Christian Drescher and perhaps afterwards Max, but we'll start with Christian. Okay, well, I have a question. Often people say that if you do livestock protection from GAP, then the money will be lacking in other areas. Is that so? What do you say about it? Especially also if we talk about the regional area, can we say that if I regionally finance livestock protection, then the GAP money will be lacking in other areas?
Yeah, there's a limited pot, of course. So there's only a certain amount of funding. The member states have the choice of how they distribute that in terms of the different measures that they choose. But it's not that the amount overall is going to grow if you suddenly have a new area to include. So yeah, it's always a choice of which measures are most important and how much you want to put into balance between different types of farming system, how much you want to balance between the different pillars, because there's also some option to move funds between the pillar 1 and the pillar 2, and what the priorities are for that member state or that region.
Thank you.
Max, hast du deine Frage zurückgezogen?
Max,
oder?
Did you withdraw your question?
Maybe you could, first of all, good morning. First of all, could you clearly highlight, when a follow-up to Christian's question is that it's often portrayed that money that is used out of the regional development funds, if it goes to wildlife, it is money that the farmer would get, and now it ends up in the hands of NGOs and I do not know what else. But as far as we understand the Regional Development Fund is GAP, there are a certain percentage of these funds which actually need to be invested in nature conservation, climate change, adaptation, so very green topics. So if you would maybe highlight, is it so simple to say we could use the money to pay a farmer or buy a tractor, where in fact actually a certain percentage of this money would need to go into nature conservation topics anyway?
Yep, that's the case, that there's a requirement to have a certain amount of the funding going into agri-environment climate measures. There's a requirement to have the eco schemes, which are a certain percentage of the pillar 1 financing. That's required on the EU level. Member states have some flexibility about where the limits are, but they have to finance environmental measures.
So it would not be that this money would be available for pure agricultural topics that we often hear. It would actually be, if the money would go into wildlife management, maybe a program for bees would not be financed, but because they are in the similar kind of nature conservation arena. So there would be rather, this money would be taken away from other climate change, adaptation, greening programs, and not directly from what the agricultural community believes is their money.
Most of it, yeah. I mean, there's different options, but yeah, most of it, if you're using agri-environment or the eco schemes or the non-productive investment, which are the main measures used.
Gut.
So thank you then. I would like to thank you very much, Ms. Marsden, for your excellent overview, and for the discussion. I would like to thank you very much.